Okay, so virtue theory. We'll start, the first ones will be the theological virtues. We'll do a little introduction, then the theological virtues, and then we'll go through the cardinal virtues. And if we have time, which we should, I have a 10-minute animation type video at the end. Has anybody ever heard or read Francis Thompson's The Hound of Heaven? Well, you'll see a modern adaptation of it. It's pretty moving. I like to try to give you something new, a little novel, but certainly not obscure. In St. Augustine's cosmology, he worked out a theme that's known as morning and evening knowledge. Is anybody familiar with this whatsoever? Oh, is it? Oh, okay. There you go. Well, yeah, it is from Cesario's book. And if you've read anything beyond that, can't remember what it said in Cesario's book, but he was given the impression, or at least setting the stage, that the angels are a source for Genesis, and that it's an unfolding of their knowledge. So because it was the fourth day before the sun and moons were actually created, what is this light? So, angels don't get knowledge like we do. If you follow Thomas Aquinas, it's through the senses. Well, they don't sense it. It's infused. So they went from the knowledge of created realities in the evening to becoming more like God in the morning, seeing them things as they exist in the world. So they were growing and sharing in a true knowledge of things, which is why he then could work out why some of the angels then declined. They, in a sense, were giving a peek of the future. And one of the speculations, is all it is that some of the angels could not comprehend, why would you do this for these created animals you're calling humans? We want nothing of that type of thing. So the knowledge of created realities, whether they exist in their own nature, from the evening, becoming more like God as they move into morning. So it's really just a shedding off of yourself and trying to conform to God. Just this sets the stage for what virtue theory is for us. Virtue theory isn't just something, exterior to us. It's something that has to transform who we are and makes us more like Him. So that's a nice understanding of how the Spirit works with us, so we can cooperate with what God does in our lives. It's not simply, honest. You can see there that we, this wasn't even it. See, I'm looking ahead of myself. Must be on another page. So I'll forget about that. I'll come back to it. The outpouring of divine truth resembles the flow of being from the world. Word is a primordial principle to possession in the beings of things. I'm going to have to rearrange these slides so they follow the way I think and not the way I wrote them down. So here you go, Frank. You're asking about habitus last week. Habitus is really like the possession of a disposition, right? So here, grace transforms us. It's the psychological capacities of human nature. At the same time, it allows the person to use these capacities in ways that are created and easily adapted to new situations. So we are always participating in that grace. The theological virtues, Cesario tells us, is the shape of Christian ethics. So we can think of them as like the form or the soul of Christian ethics. And these cardinal virtues, they are the organizing principles upon which we build our ethics. So maybe the material aspects behind it. Here's what I was thinking of. The Spirit is the wind and the believer is the oarsman. So we always have this ability to steer where we'd like to go. We're not being blown wildly around the waters. We're not fatalist. We believe we have free will. This would be a good poetic way to say, how do we cooperate with the grace that God gives us? Now, for those of us that are so loyal sons and daughters of the church, we don't have to really make the case here too much. So the fact that we have a breakdown in shared moral standards. So the Enlightenment attempted to replace a theologically grounded morality with one founded on reason. Now, we're not opposed to reason. It's one of the two wings. But unlike Kant or Nietzsche, we're not looking to base it solely on reason. So natural sciences discarded Aristotelian metaphysics. So if you remember the four causes, the formal cause, the material cause, the efficient cause, the final cause, they're really just concerned pretty much sciences with the efficient cause. You know, what made this happen, right? They no longer look as to what form did it take, like the idea or the concept, what is the material behind it, and what is the goal, the theological aspect of it. So they discarded Aristotle, metaphysics, biology, and physics, and the same became true abandoning teleology and morality. So all of a sudden now, in morality, we don't look at an end. Where does this go? You know, so we'll look more at human flourishing here in this world. We see a world of autonomy, individualism, self-assertion, naturalism, where now the laws and the forces in the world, whether it be physics or such, they become the standard for understanding the world and the human person. Now, this is from Alistair McIntyre's book, Back to Virtue. Some people think he overplays it a little bit, but I'm sorry, sister, for so much here to read. But it's a nice little paragraph, so I thought I wanted to put it all in your notes. What he's doing, he's giving an analogy. What if science would have been thrown under the bus in the same way that religion was thrown under the bus? That's his point. So imagine a scenario, there's a widespread catastrophe, and the public has blamed the scientists. It was their fault. There are riots. They hunt down scientists, they kill them, they burn their writings, and they destroy their instruments. The people who are anti-science, they rise to power, and they see it to it that science is not taught in schools or in universities. Later on, enlightened people wish to revive it. Now, he's trying to make a nod towards the people that are trying to be moral just through reason alone. All right? They're looking for ways to revive this morality, but they don't want the past. So he says, but most of what they've known has been forgotten. The fragmentary knowledge that remains, ordinary people still argue about the merits of the theory of relativity and evolution. So they have the language, the terms and the words. They remain in the public discourse. They know words and terms like specific gravity, neutrino. Children are taught about them. But little of what is really being spoken of or talked about has anything to do with natural science. Most that has presupposed these terms has been lost. Anyone pro-science has a difficult time rationally engaging the general public in discussion. The underpinnings and context are no longer present. His point is, that's how we are. You know, we know the language. The public discourse, the public square, they know the terms. They don't know the context and underpinnings. So when we breach these and try to bring up an argument, there's no context for them. So we find ourselves in this turmoil, what John Paul II calls new evangelism. How then do we approach these people? This is why the last session next week we'll have to be creative. What ideas do we have to approach people? It's a good book. So this is the single virtue of the modern world. Be tolerant. Although very few people know what the word tolerant means. You know, if tolerance means to endure an evil that you're either unwilling or unable to overcome, then I wish no one to be tolerant with me, right? I wish you to engage me. Nobody wants to be considered, you know, in other words, think of like in the medical field, when they might check your tolerance towards certain drugs. They're trying to think, can you endure this? But the modern world only understands tolerance as acceptance. So when they say, tolerate me, they are saying, accept me as I am now.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, because you can listen to somebody and not agree with them, but accept where they're coming from.
Absolutely.
And not, and so I'm thinking maybe that's.
And disagreement is thought to be disrespect. So if you disagree with me, you either don't understand me because you're not smart enough, or you disrespect me because you refuse to tolerate me.
Well, you choose not to disagree.
Or you choose, right.
Yeah.
But they should use the term saying, you refuse to accept me. Gay marriage is a perfect example. It's impossible. It's not, am I for it or against it? It's not a thing. And it's not even a Christian argument. Again, remember Masha Gessen made the argument, the Russian journalist. She said, I'm the first person that came out, as far as she knows, publicly in Russia. I did not live this life to lie about what I want to do when I get there. That meaning when we are allowed to marry. She says marriage should not exist. End of story. That should be our discussion. And it's not that there's some overarching manipulation on the part of the public. It has a lot to do with what Alistair McIntyre says. They have these terms in use that often don't fall into the context. So if tolerance means acceptance, and they have acceptance equated with love, and Christianity is about love, then why don't you love these people? And you're trying to backpedal to straighten these terms out and everything. So we have a culture that doesn't know what an argument is, right? Like when I taught logic, a lot of times students, they can't use, one of the exercises are identify what is or is not an argument, and then there's all these examples. People don't know. They don't know if it's an assertion, it's an argument. And then we do hear the word argument, we're almost convinced that that means quarreling. But argument's just, how will I form it? It's like rhetoric. Rhetoric, in an Aristotelian sense, is how you construct discussions. Today, what does it mean? Cheap talk. So we have our work cut out for us. But one of the things is terms have to be clear. And one of those is and this isn't a Christian argument. If you go to YouTube, there's a channel called either Big Think or Big Idea. And one of the guys from Monty Python, I'm not sure if it's Cleese, him, and there's another one by Penn and Teller. Well, it's Penn. Which one talks? Is it Penn? It doesn't matter. But they both do a segment on tolerance, saying, this is ridiculous. We have to stop saying be tolerant of things. And they make a good point. Even though they are diametrically opposed to what we would believe as faithful Catholics, you can have a conversation with them because they share the background on this. You'll disagree in the end, and they probably will see that as respectful disagreement because you've engaged them. And you're not just, they won't walk away saying, I thought you Christians are supposed to love everybody. They're beyond that. They already know that that's a misuse of the terms. All right, so let's just say it so that we cover all our bases, but virtues have to do with human persons. Okay, you can't ask an animal to be virtuous. They are what they are. So this is only with persons, although obviously this does count for angels, right? Humans aren't the only persons. There are different ways that you can look at things. There's two negative ways, not negative, but insufficient. And value ethics would be one of them. Because values are, how do we determine what the value of a certain thing is? Is it the majority? Is it the powerful? Is it tradition? So values are going to be very subjective, and they tend to be exterior. And even things that people value could be a particular vice in the world, whether it's in economics or whether it's in some other social sphere. Principle-based ethics, and I don't want to overplay this because obviously the Ten Commandments and Beatitudes are very important for our moral life, but they make the case that they are principle-based. So a little deontological in a sense, and they certainly can help form our interior virtues, but they tend to judge behaviors as to is or is not deficient. So they compel and they motivate, but Cesariel makes a claim that they remain to a certain degree in the exterior. So we will talk about virtue-based ethics. they are concerned with inner motives, and they contribute to character formation. One last little thing before we move on, because it's something that comes up, and I can't imagine that it wouldn't come up in your futures, especially those of you that are in the diaconate working in the parishes. They won't call it moral luck, but they'll say, you know, don't some people have lives that moral luck. Yeah, L-U-C-K. It's a criticism against secular virtue ethics. Like, some people just are lucky. They might be in the right circumstances, or they might get the help and encouragement that they need to reach moral maturity, where others won't. If the development of virtue and the opposite, vice, if it's left to luck, can we really praise those who are virtuous and then blame those who are vicious for something that was entirely outside of their control? Now, nobody will frame it like that, but they will. I mean, anybody, you work in prison ministry, are with people that come out. Some of these people's lives are so tragic, you wonder, you know, by the grace of God, there go I. So, you know, how can they be held to the same virtuous standard that we do? Now, the answer to this is that we're not going to, you get subjective values as to what is or is not virtuous. That question's more about culpability. You know, if they have a different life than I have, then maybe there are hurdles that I never had to jump over. That's between them and God. We don't judge that stuff, right? But because we don't judge that stuff, we don't then turn around and, to say it in a pedestrian way, lower the bar on this end, right? You know, these are still the virtues, and they're still attainable. They're still coming through grace. It could be that your life is simply that tragic.
So in this, like, going down the value-based, the principle-based, virtue-based, have you ever heard that it's like a saying, your words turn into your actions turn into, I forget what it is, but and it hardens into character. Is that kind of like the...
Well, it wouldn't be like, this isn't like a ladder, but that would fit into virtue ethics. In other words, well, you see that sometimes, like, since virtue is a habit, we'll define it. Well, the more that you work on a habit, the easier then it becomes for this to come into fruition. And virtue ethics have to have their interior, but they have to have an exterior manifestation. Or what is it? We don't sit there and get into our spiritual gooiness, you know? I mean, this has to work into the world. But and the two, don't forget that that's why priests will ask how many times you've sinned. You know, they don't have a clicker. They're trying to determine how deep is this habit. And I've had, you know, many priest friends, as you do, and, you know, especially with things like adultery and such, they'll even try to ferret out, was this a moment of weakness? Or was there like a developed connection? Because that's going to make the difference, because the habit is going to change the scenario. So that's the classical definition of virtue, right? An habitual disposition of the mind and heart. As you practice it, it's between a deficiency and an excess, and we're moving towards perfection. Obviously, we'll not be perfected here on earth. The Catholic Church always takes whatever wisdom it finds, wherever it finds it, and it tries to bring it into the faith. So this comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And if you ever heard, you may not have heard the Latin, the medius stat virtu, but you might have heard the virtue stands in the middle. So if we were going to talk about the virtue of courage or fortitude, and think of sin in this regard. Remember how sin's missing the mark? Okay, well, you can go off on either side. And anytime you go either to deficiency or you go to the excess, you're missing the mark. So sin, it's better if we don't think of it as 180 degrees from the good. It doesn't work like that. That's a very Western mechanical way to look at it. So a person, say, in battle, might be scared witless, but they're courageous, okay? If they ran away, we would call them, cowards. If they had that bravado where they just jumped out of the foxhole and started running, that's not bravery. It's rashness. Okay, that too is an excess. I won't go through all of these, but you can see how it all works. Like witty. I am certain that is me. My wife sometimes finds me to be in the excess. I think it's not fair. I shouldn't say that. She would never say that about me. This has to do also with circumstances and with situations in life, life vocations. So when it comes, say, for like temperance, obviously in sexuality, okay, a religious is not going to hold the same deficiency and excess as a married person would, okay? Let's see. Fasting. What might be insensible, to a normal person during periods in our liturgical calendar where it's important, we have to take into context. So all these things obviously have to fall into how we're using them and such. But you get it. Okay, faith. We'll define faith as the absolute fidelity to the truth of God, the whole truth, as God reveals himself to man. So these are theological virtues. But these have to be infused and given to you. You cannot just acquire these. Okay? So faith is a gift. So I had a friend who's atheist once. I think he said it mockingly, although he was correct. He said, I don't believe there's a God. Apparently, I've never been given the gift of faith. It's wonderful that you understand that that's what it is. It's unlikely that you're going to use that excuse to the end, but, go ahead. The goal of faith is always God, okay? Formally God. He's the first truth. Materially, we will seek out truths, like what's the building of it. We will seek out the truths that will lead us towards that end, which is God. So God is our good end, all right? I know it all seems obvious. This is right out of Thomas Aquinas. Faith manifests itself in the act of believing. What I try to do, at least with these, is give you the gifts of the Holy Spirit that perfects them, and then some vices and such that might detract from them. So this is understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. Now, everybody learned these different. I had to learn it's wisdom, understanding, counsel, knowledge, piety, fortitude to fear the Lord. That's how I learned it.
Right.
Did I get them all?
Just you're describing that.
Oh, that. Devices that are contrary to faith. And this is like what I tried to work in my journals, even not overt, but put it in there, are blindness of mind and dullness of mind. Blindness of mind is obstinacy. I mean, some people, if they refuse to believe, which is part of the issue with miracles, right? I mean, miracles will conform us deeper to the faith, and some people say, which I believe is so, that God performs these just sometimes to uplift our spirits. We need that. But the reality is the reason why the church worries that we put too much stock in them is because then we're going to start following the miracles like they did in the with the manna from heaven and everything else in the desert. And they forget that it's the giver of these that they're supposed to be in union with. So miracles are fine for those who witness. If somehow there was some spiritual manifestation here that we could not explain and we all saw it, we would go and tell everybody else, and you know as well as I, they would question everything we've seen. So they want to see the miracles, right? So the guy will go out and taunt God, saying, strike me dead with the lightning bolt. What if he did? You know, only people that saw it would be impressed. Nobody else would believe it, correct? So obstinacy and dullness of mind, you know, that sometimes we have to rely on other people to help us with the gift to understand these things. We don't always grasp everything ourselves. This is one of the enemies of education. So I just have one slide for each of the theological virtues. And then I think after that we'll take our break. Hope, the desire, and the firm expectation in a future possible good. All those parts of this definition are important, okay? If it's not possible, you can't hope for it. None of us can hope to live to 200. Although I read they're reversing aging in mice. I don't know what that means. They should pick animals that we'd like to see stick around longer. And it has to be something good. And I think it's Chesterton that says, you know, hope is always future-oriented. I know that sounds so obvious, but do we ever stop and think that, you know, we're never hoping for things in the present or hope that the past changes? So, you know, hope has that sense of, you know, of futureness to it, that there is something there that can change, nonetheless. And you can't hope for someone else. You know, we talk in those terms sometimes, but really we have these strong desires. Hope comes from the will. Like, you can't hope for somebody else's salvation. You can't hope for somebody else to do this or that. We use the word like that, but strictly speaking, that's not what the word hope would mean. So God is both formally and materially. Like before, God was, with faith, God was the formal cause, and believing and truths were the material cause. Here, he's both the formal and material cause. There you go. Chesterton says, hope is a pious platitude when things go well, but we sure will grab hold of it when things aren't going well. You know, which is why so many people, when life hits them between the eyes, there's an awakening, right? And that's when, and that's okay. That's when hope grabs hold of us. The gifts of the Holy Spirit that perfect it. Now we're looking more of things in the will, like fortitude, piety, fear of the Lord. It's funny, if you have any friends who are evangelical, the once saved, always saved, you know, when I explained once that theologically what they are believing is a sin against the virtue of hope, I thought that was quite humorous. But it's presumption. It's presuming on God's good grace. So you Catholics don't know if you're going to heaven. Well, we have a firm expectation in a future possible good. So we hope that. But no, I didn't get anything signed. Okay, it doesn't work like that. So we have to make sure that we see that we're not presuming. The other end of this is when we simply fall into despair, that there is no hope for me. At that point, too, both these things are sins against hope. Now, things like soothsaying and fortune-telling, the Long Island medium. I thought that was a drink until somebody told me it really is a show on TV. Those, you know, the problem with those is, you know, how do we pastorally deal with these people? Like, you lose somebody, and you miss them so bad, so you're reaching out all over. It's like, you know, we get that. What it must be like that this person is gone in your life, you know. But do you understand that it, you know, if we only couch that in terms of a sin, you know, the church doesn't like that. You know, it's a sin to go to the, you know, they're not quite getting it. Their problem is they have an issue with hope. You know, at some level, do you understand what our Christian faith says? And you wouldn't, you know, I get why you're going to that. You know, I can honestly tell you, I would have that inclination over things. Because you just wonder. I really wonder if Mom would come through. Those types of things. But when you really stop to think about it, you're lacking something. You're lacking something that is a gift from God, and it's the virtue of hope. So forget it. Yes, the church teaches that you should not do it, but they don't set it up as a rule. There's something going on here in your spiritual life that's not square, and that's where we need to meet you, and that's where we need to talk about it. So I think that's what's good about understanding these various virtues and what, and you could see here too, I'm not trying to be mechanical, but what do you pray for? How about we pray together that you have strength to get through this? That you can understand the holiness that God is calling you to. And that it's God alone who deserves our praise and our efforts. Maybe that's where we need to go with this. And then rather than setting down the gamut, stop doing that, don't go, because, their heart's not going to change. You work on this. Okay, love. Inclining the human will to cherish God for his own sake above all things. So you can see here right away that you could not, in a moment of total love, give up your salvation for the other person. It's a misdirection of where this virtue goes. We love God above all things. We will do nothing to dissuade ourselves from that. So God is regarded here under the aspect of his own intrinsic goodness. He's not man's good. He's not just a goal for us. He's good in himself, drawing us towards him. There are fruits of charity. Joy and peace, those are typically known as the effects. So a person who has developed this virtue, allowed this virtue to develop within him. You can develop this even though it's infused, right? You can have the effect of both joy and peace, which Pope Francis has said repeatedly. We have to be loving and smiling. There's no such thing as a sourpuss saint. It just doesn't work like that. And as far as mercy, the idea that we want to relieve the wants and the concerns and the cares of others. Sometimes it's, for the person who is struggling with the virtue of hope, maybe in our way it's merciful to reach out to them and to almost, empathize with them. And then, how does that show up externally? Well, in that particular case, we'd call it some sort of fraternal correction. Almsgiving, kindness. So this is how it should show itself. There's always that outward manifestation of the inner virtue. Thomas Aquinas will always talk about love in terms of friendship. So he says that's how it appropriates itself, with or without the opportunity for reciprocity. So if you can, achieve good levels of friendships with somebody, and if you have more than a couple good friends, you are very, very blessed. It fosters it while remaining disinterested in it as an end. In other words, it's almost like you have to work towards love and work towards friendship without actually doing it. I know it sounds paradoxical, but when they say when you're single, the way to find somebody is not to look for them. It's sort of in that same manner here. And this too comes from Aristotle. So he always talked about three types of friendships: friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and then friendships based on the good. And the friendships based on the good were obviously superior to everything. So even in human sexuality, if I remember right, I hope I talked about the third or the transcendent good outside of each person. So when two people, are so in love with each other, they feel like they are complete, that could develop into a mutual egoism. It's almost like a love fest between the two people, and it caves in on itself. So there has to be something transcendent outside of those two. At a very practical level, people might find some sort of activity that they both enjoy. We like mountain climbing. We like going bowling, you name it. But as you know, any type of activity, at some point is going to end. People will say we live for our children, right? Bad idea. How long are your children going to live with you? And then when they come out, you're going to look at each other as strangers. So even in friendship, Aristotle says there has to be a good outside that both are aiming to. If you can even wind up with 2 or 3 of these in a lifetime, what a blessing. So in the Catholic Cyclopedia it says, his charity towards God is paramount among the virtues, and faith in that regard is the foundation, and hope is the incentive. So that's how the whole thing comes together. Hope gives us the incentive towards love. Faith becomes the foundation upon which it, but charity in the end. Because as we will see, if it's not here, okay. In heaven, all that remains is love. Hope. You've already arrived. You know, when we use our GPS and it says, you know, you have arrived or whatever, you no longer need hope. You are there. There is no future expectation of a possible good. You are now in his presence. Hope has served its purpose. And so too has faith. We no longer have to have that foundation. At this point, this is all that's left. And if you read Dante in Paradiso, it's so incredibly bright, you know, that God's love, there's like nothing to see. It's just that intense love and light. So of all the 3, charity will remain. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. Let's take 10 minutes.